Hello, everyone. Welcome to our CIGS seminar. Today, we have the privilege of welcome Professor J. Rosengard from Harvard Kennedy School. For the past 3 years, due to the COVID-19 crisis, our institute have been unable to invite him to share his views with us. Fortunately, this year, thanks to the partial lifting of the draconian entry restriction, we are able to welcome him and organize a recorded seminar. This time, I would like to show you the line of programs. First, as I said, our introduction, and followed by a presentation by Professor Rosengard. The title is Rising Expectations of United States Economy, Whither Thou Goest. So that he will speak about 15 to 20 minutes, and followed by discussions. Fortunately, we have a very talented discussant from Osaka, Tomoyuki Fukumoto, former Secretary General of the International Department of the Bank of Japan. Tomo is right now a professor at Osaka University of Economics. Tomo and Jay have been good friends since Tomo's time at the Kennedy School between 2008 and 2009. I remember studying the textbook on economic sector economics, co-authored by Jay and Nobel laureate economist Stiglitz of Columbia University. However, having studied this book, both the United States and Japan still have a lot of problems in the private sector. So I look forward to Professor Rosengard's presentation. Without further ado, let's get started.
Hello. It's wonderful to be back in Tokyo for the first time in 3 years. Although unfortunately, COVID concerns have compelled us to make this a recorded rather than an in-person event. Nonetheless, it is wonderful to be back here, and it is both an honor and a pleasure to speak again at CIGS. Given that this is a recorded event, we would like to make it a conversation. So I will only speak for about 15 to 20 minutes to maximize time for a dialogue with my esteemed colleagues. You will see that my short presentation is essentially a point of departure for our discussion and is comprised primarily of highly contentious and yet unresolved issues regarding the U.S. economy in 2023. The title, Rising Expectations, O United States Economy, Whither Thou Goest, is actually a play on the words inflation, rising expectations, or expectations that prices will rise. And if the key is, if enough people think that there will be inflation, that's the expectations that prices will rise, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy, regardless of the underlying causes of inflation and regardless of what the Fed, the central bank, does. So right now, the great debate in the United States, what is the best way to deal with current high inflation? In the following 5 slides, I will break this down into 5 sub-questions. But of course, there are many other factors that will affect the U.S. economic performance in 2023, such as the war in Ukraine, China's transition from zero COVID policies. But these are all factors that are external beyond the control of the United States. So what I would like to do is to focus on things the United States actually does control, which is its own fiscal and monetary policy. But I'd be happy to discuss these other issues in our discussion after my comments. The 5 subsidiary questions for this great debate are, first, what are the key drivers of inflation? What is the most appropriate policy tool to address these key drivers of inflation? How can we interpret contradictory economic indicators? Which is the most likely scenario for this year? And then how might the current debt ceiling conflict affect this scenario? So what are the key drivers of inflation? We know that inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods and services. That is, a gap between supply and demand. The question is, what is driving the gap? And there are really two schools of thought. One says that it's basically driven by excess demand. Perhaps we spent too much dealing with the pandemic, especially the very last pandemic stimulus package under President Biden that was enacted to fulfill a campaign pledge. Some say this was too much, too late, and all of this extra money circulating with not enough goods and services is fueling inflation. They also say that for 3 years of restrictions, Americans were not able to spend. And now they want to go places, they want to buy things, regardless of the prices. And so this is pent-up demand that could be driving inflation. That is basically the view of the Fed, the central bank. But others say the problem is really supply chain constraints. Sectoral disruptions in supply chain. For example, chips for automobiles, shipping for almost everything. And when you look at this, there are also labor shortages. So increasing interest rates really doesn't address the supply chain issues. So you have all the pain of increased interest rates with none of the benefits. So these are the two main schools of thought. Some believe that it's both, and I'm in that third camp where I believe that both are contributing to inflation. But there's still a lot of debate. What is the relative contribution of excess demand versus supply constraints? And what is the time frame? Are some of these problems just temporary that will resolve themselves, or are these underlying structural issues that need different policy responses? So again, when we say what is the most appropriate policy tool to address these key drivers of inflation, your prescription, the medicine you prescribe, depends on your diagnosis as you're looking at the economy. Different diagnoses lead to different possible policy responses. So if the problem is mainly excess demand, then the appropriate response would probably be a tight monetary policy, which the Fed is currently pursuing. But then there are also issues about the appropriate inflation index, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. If you're going to increase interest rates, how much should you increase them? How quickly should you increase them? So even if you think the general problem is demand and you're going to have to slow down the demand, there's a lot of disagreement about exactly the specifics of how you do this. And the problem is, if it's self-resolving, you would prefer perhaps to do nothing. But doing nothing means that it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is, if enough people think there's going to be inflation, there will be inflation regardless of what the government does. So these are some of the dilemmas. Even if you agree in general, the problem is excess demand. But if it's really a supply problem, then you're really looking for targeted fiscal policy. So if you don't have enough goods and services, enough supplies, then a sensible policy response would be to end the trade war with China and lower tariffs on imports. That will increase the supply of goods to meet this great demand. If the problem is also a labor shortage, and we have that throughout our economy, then you need more labor. So liberalize the immigration policy and facilitate legal work visas. These are things that were changed under President Trump and could be reversed through the executive branch under President Biden. A lot of people are concerned that the U.S. economy is becoming more and more concentrated. Fewer and fewer firms are controlling entire sectors, and you don't have enough competition. So another response would be enforce our antitrust laws and try to encourage more competition, especially in the new economy. So again, it really depends on what you think the problem is, how you might address the constraints or the drivers of inflation. I should say that if the Fed is basically thinking the main problem is excess demand, my colleague and co-author, as June mentioned, Joe Stiglitz, thinks it's really a supply problem. So even two authors don't always agree completely. Senator Elizabeth Warren thinks it's a supply problem. And their concern is if it's really a supply problem and you raise interest rates, you get all the pain and none of the gain of increasing the interest rates. So respected economists, some of my colleagues at the Kennedy School, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Jason Furman, the former chief economic advisor to Obama, Larry Summers, they think it's essentially excess demand. So eminent economists, well-respected economists, disagree on the drivers of inflation in the United States. And then we've got a lot of contradictory economic indicators that makes this even more confusing. For example, normally when you have persistent and significant labor shortages, you have a growth in real wages to try to reach a new equilibrium, supply and demand of labor. But this is really not happening widely in the US economy. The unemployment rate during the Great Recession was around 10%. It rose to almost 15% during COVID shutdowns, and it's now below 4%. It's 3.7%. That's below full employment. So you would expect real wages to rise, and they are, but not faster than inflation. So again, people are puzzled. Why is the market not adjusting to the labor shortage by a more rapid increase in wages? And then we measure inflation. The commonly reported indicator is the Consumer Price Index, CPI, but the Fed's preferred indicator is something called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or PCE. And that tends to be lower than the CPI. So if you're looking at inflation in the United States, June last year it was about 9.1%. This is the CPI. November it had dropped to around 7.1%, but the PCI is below 6%. So again, you're trying to measure the same thing using different metrics of degree of inflation. And then we have macroeconomic data versus microeconomic data. If you look at the macroeconomic data for the United States, it looks pretty good. Growth is pretty good. Job creation, net job creation is good. The macro indicators look quite healthy. But then you see the macro level, businesses are preparing for a recession. They're cutting staff. They're reducing inventory. They're not making new investments. And so again, the macro numbers look good, but at the micro level, businesses are preparing for a recession. If enough businesses think there's going to be a recession, there will be a recession. So again, you're looking at valid numbers, accurate numbers, but interpretation is quite different. So the question, what is the most likely scenario for 2023? So I will give you three options. Option one, the Fed does nothing and instead asks the government, the Treasury, to focus on supply chain issues. This option is already gone. It's off the table given the Fed's rapid increase in interest rates in 2022. At the beginning of the year, the benchmark rate was near zero. Now it's between 4.25% and 4.5%. And the Fed's projections that it will go over 5%, around 5.1% in 2023. So option one is finished. It's gone. Then you have option two. This is what we call a soft landing, where the Fed raises interest rates enough to prevent a wage price spiral, but not too much so that it causes a recession. This is, as we say, the Goldilocks solution. Not too big, not too small, not too fast, just right. It sounds beautiful in theory, but it's really, really hard to do in practice. But this is the Fed's preferred strategy. Then you have option 3, where you raise interest rates too much, too quickly, causing either stagflation, that is inflation with no growth, like we had in the 1980s, or a hard landing, which is a recession. And you should view option 3 in the context of US history, where the Fed lost all credibility in the 1970s for not responding quickly enough, soon enough. And in the end, in the early 1980s, they were forced to respond quite drastically. So under then Fed Chairman Paul Volcker, in the early 80s, interest rates hit almost 20%. And it triggered 2 recessions, not just one, but 2 recessions, and one that drove unemployment over 10%. So this is the specter that haunts the current Fed. Don't make the same mistakes that we did in the 1970s and 1980s. And the absolute worst nightmare for the Fed is stagflation. It's the worst of everything. It's even worse than having a hard landing and a recession. So these are the 3 options that people are debating. And the question really now, is it going to be 2? Is the Fed going to get it right? Or is it going to be option 3, where the timing or the magnitude of interest rate increases might not be right? And I'd like to add one more factor that's going to affect U.S. Economic performance this year. We have something called the current debt ceiling conflict. So what is this? Why does Congress have to raise the debt ceiling? I think only Denmark is the only other country I know of that has this, where the legislature has to approve an increase in the debt ceiling. But in Denmark, they always do it well before it's necessary. It's never a problem. And in the United States, it was always a formality until a couple of decades ago. And it's important to note it, that when you raise the debt ceiling, it doesn't mean you're approving new spending. All you're doing is allowing the government to finance expenditures, budget expenditures that have already been approved by Congress. So again, it's not new spending, it's a Treasury operation to finance authorized, congressionally authorized expenditures. But now, rather than becoming a formality, it's become a symbolic fight. And it's been led primarily by Republicans as a reaction to losing fights over the budget previously. So they lost the appropriations fight. So now they're saying we're going to stop spending by not increasing the debt ceiling. When will we reach the debt ceiling? Hello, we reached it last week. So we're already there. We've reached the statutory debt limit of 31.4 trillion US dollars. But it's more complicated because Treasury can juggle payments, they can do all sorts of accounting things for about 5 months. But in early June, the maneuvering has to end. They run out of budget tricks, accounting tricks, and you either raise the debt ceiling or you default on your obligations. So we have some time. It's going to be in the headlines for the next 4 to 5 months. What are the chances Congress will not raise the debt ceiling in time? In the past, the Republicans have always caved in at the very last minute. But we say this is like a game of chicken. So chicken is when you have 2 cars speeding head on at each other, and at the very last minute, one of them turns off. When somebody blinks. So in the past, it's been the Republicans, but they've had a very high price for doing this, which has affected expenditures for the next 5 to 10 years. So the problem here is that the Congress is so polarized and the Republicans themselves are divided. And we saw this in the recent fight for Kevin McCarthy to become Speaker of the House. He had to make many concessions to the extreme right wing of his party, And part of that is not agreeing to raise the debt ceiling without major concessions from the Democrats. So it's very serious this time. What might happen if Congress fails to raise the debt ceiling in time? Well, it's something you don't want to contemplate. Just the threat that they wouldn't do it in the past has greatly increased the cost of carrying debt because interest rates went up because of a risk premium. So just the threat already spooks markets. The idea that could actually happen, it's something that we basically don't even want to think about. So what will happen? And I'll give you three possible outcomes. One is that at the last minute, the Republicans give in. It's all a drama. It's a little bit like the Japanese drama. But in the end, they will raise the debt ceiling. That's one possibility. A second is that they don't raise the debt ceiling, but even without raising the debt ceiling, Treasury can still pay about 80% of its obligations. And so they find a way to prioritize these, making sure that all debt is paid. But that means they have to cut other things. And a lot of these are mandatory entitlements, which raises a lot of legal issues, like Social Security. The third option that President Clinton threatened in 2011 during a standoff over the debt ceiling is to invoke the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This was passed shortly after the Civil War in 1868, and it says, and I quote, "Validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned." So they basically ignore Congress, and the president invoking the 14th Amendment raises the debt ceiling himself. Now, this would probably eventually go to the courts and end up in the Supreme Court, and people have no idea how the court would rule, but this would buy time and essentially overrule Congress using this constitutional basis. We don't know what's going to happen, but this is another unknown factor that could have a dramatic effect on the U.S. economy in 2023. And with that, I will stop so that we can have a conversation with my wonderful colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, actually for wonderful presentation. And the world is right now paying close attention to what the Treasury Secretary Yellen and the Fed Chairman Powell have to say. So that this has been a very good presentation. And now I move to discussion time. Here, as I said before, Fukumoto-san in Osaka. So that I'll ask Fukumoto-san to raise several questions. And upon each question, I ask Jay to respond to the question. Thank you very much indeed. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jay, for your fascinating presentation. Yeah, I think you laid out almost all the factors which made inflationary pressure to U.S. economy. So I'm keen on asking as many questions as possible. Yes, but let me go back to the 2021. I remember Jerome Powell, chairman of the Fed, in August 2021, said inflation is transitory. But after that, in November, he totally changed his outlook, saying, and then Fed start raising rates very quickly over the past year, from nearly 0 to 4.25 to 4.5%. So what made Fed judge wrongly? In other words, do you think if Fed had raised interest rates more mildly, then that current situation should be quite different, or one way or the other, because of the excess demand or due to the big government spending, high inflation was inevitable. What your take on that? And my impression is that in 2021, Fed acted a bit politically. At that time, the Biden administration's focus was on the full employment or recovery of the employment and the economy, so that Fed wanted to maintain easy monetary condition. But after that, the administration's focus changed to the how to tackle the inflation, so that it seems to me that the Fed's stance changed dramatically. So could I elaborate more on that?
It's a great question. I would say that Chairman Powell is adamant that he's apolitical and his decisions are data-driven. He stood up to Trump when he raised interest rates over Trump's objections. Now raising interest rates has a lot of political opposition from the Democrats. I mentioned Elizabeth Warren as one. So what changed? The data changed. Originally, he thought it was a transitory problem, mainly caused by supply chain issues that would self-resolve as the economy adapted. But the later data indicated that it was more than supply issues. There was excess demand, and it wasn't transitory. It wasn't going away. So he will say it's all data-driven, and his decisions, as well as the board, is driven by the latest information. And they have more data than anybody, but a lot of it is publicly available. So you have a lot of private firms, bank economists, and so on, look at the same data. But the Fed has the biggest database. They have some of the country's best economists. So in a nutshell, I would say the data changed and policy changed. And Powell knows that interest rate increases is politically very unpopular, especially among the party that controls the White House and the Senate, the Democrats. But like I said, he resisted pressure from Trump. He resists pressure from Biden because he said that he's trying to follow the Fed's mandate and the data.
Thank you very much. So, and the current situation seems that, the inflationary pressure, it has been weakening recently. So, and but we have to know that how sticky will this inflation will be. So, in order to understand this, I think important thing is which factor are the transitory factor or temporary factors, of which factors are structural factors. As you mentioned, demand side and supply side, but we should sort out which factors are structural and which factors are transitory. So in the end, what will be the some inflation year-on-year price hike will be. So could you please elaborate on that a little bit more? Yeah.
Again, it's a great question, and it's the key question. How much of it is transitory and will be self-resolving, and how much of it is structural that needs a more forceful, a longer-term response? And to be honest, we don't know. And this is the big uncertainty for the Fed. And so they have, the last increase was a little bit smaller than previous ones. It was, I believe, 0.5% rather than 0.75%. But they said they're going to continue to increase. And my own feeling is, even though it is important to know what's structural and what's transitory, in the end, you have to deal with the psychology of inflation and the wage price spiral, regardless of the driving factors. And I think this is foremost on the mind of Chairman Powell is he wants to change the expectations of inflation, whatever the cause. And it seems like there's a lot of room for growth, even if you slow it down a bit without going into recession or certainly a deep recession. But they'll monitor the same data, they'll watch it carefully, and they'll try to see also what's caused by external shocks, like energy and food. Projections are that energy costs will go down. Food costs might also go down. So looking at all these different factors, some internal, some external, we really don't know what it's transitory, how sticky it is. It's, like I said, it is the question. And Chairman Powell's philosophy is, let's just continue to track the data and try to respond appropriately. But the signal to the market is that the Fed will not tolerate a high rate of inflation, even if the costs of trying to slow it down are high. And that's the market signal to deal with the psychology of self-fulfilling inflation, the wage price spiral. So what I mean by that is, as prices go up, workers demand higher wages. Demand higher wages, prices go up. And it's really difficult to break that. And that's, I think, foremost on his mind, even at the risk of perhaps overreacting a bit, is better than underreacting. I think that's the mindset of the Fed right now. I wish I could answer your question. I'd probably be very rich if I could.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm asking difficult questions. But in the slide 6, you laid out 3 options, and you already deleted option 1. So the chances are option 2 or option 3. So I think you haven't decided. You cannot absolutely say which is will be the answer. But could I ask, which options are you leaning toward? Yeah, option 2 or option 3? Yeah, could I ask a bit more?
Yeah, I would expect nothing less than very difficult questions from my ex-Bank of Japan esteemed colleague. So I'm going to give you an economist answer. How about 2.5? Option 2.5, which means
okay.
What it means is that there might be a mild and short recession, but I don't think we were heading to a deep long-term recession. You know, it's really hard to get it just right. There are time lags, behavior changes, expectations change. So it will either be 2 or 2.5, meaning you overshoot it a little bit. There's a slight slowdown, which might not be all bad. And I should say one of the other benefits of the current strategy is even if you overshoot it, now you've regained a monetary tool, which is that you can lower interest rates if you have to. When they're at 0, you've lost that monetary tool other than print more money, essentially, generate more money. So there is a benefit even if you overshoot it a little bit. You now have a very powerful monetary tool that you've essentially lost when interest rates were 0 for a very long time. So yes, 2.5.
I see. Thank you. So let me elaborate more on the some structural factors which would affect inflationary pressure. One is carbon neutral. Second will be U.S.-China tensions. So let me ask you about U.S.-China trade tensions and some trajectory of globalization. Yeah, as Dan Roderick said, I agree with him in that hyper-globalization is already over. But and the U.S. tension could change the supply chain distribution, and but some reallocation of factories or other things could raise production cost, which would chronically raise production cost, and which in turn could become the structural factor to the world inflation. So So what is the take on the trajectory of the future supply chain or globalization, and this trajectory, what kind of impact would it would have on the inflation in the world, global inflation?
Yeah, I think China clearly, as the world's either largest or second largest economy, depending on how you count, is important. And I think what the COVID-19 pandemic showed was vulnerability to overdependence on one production location. So I think what you see now is the idea of supply chain resilience. That is perhaps paying a bit more, which will increase production costs to reduce the risk of supply chain disruptions. So you see, for example, a lot of large corporations are looking at China plus one. So maybe they're not going to disinvest from China, but they'll expand elsewhere. And they're looking at ASEAN, Southeast Asia. So the competition among ASEAN countries is who's going to be the plus one. It's going to be Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, for example, earlier Myanmar before the conflict. So yes, there's an emphasis, a new emphasis on risk mitigation and supply chain resilience that will come at a cost, which will increase production. And the question is how much of those costs can be passed on to consumers? And that partly depends on how competitive markets are. If they're relatively uncompetitive, they will be passed on to the consumer and prices will rise. Maybe not permanently, but there'll be at least a one-off increase. But if it's very competitive, that means that profit margins will be cut and firms will be forced to become more efficient and more productive. And that's not all bad either. So I think there might be a short-term impact, but the longer-term impact, I think, because risk has costs and it's very hard to price the cost of risk. So I think that by reducing the risk of supply chain disruptions, the benefits in the end will outweigh the costs. And that's how businesses make their decisions or investment decisions. So I'm less concerned on the long-term impact on inflation and encourage that it might improve supply chain resilience.
I see. Thank you very much. And talking about carbon neutral initiatives, what kind of impact this carbon neutral initiatives would have the energy prices will be the one of the key issues to understand the structural trajectory of inflation. So I tend to think that in the past, when oil prices goes up, then shale industry in US increase quickly respond to the oil price hike and increase their investment. And their investment is quickly enough to offset some demand increase. So that in the past several years, actually, the oil price increase pressure was less fierce than it was then, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. That's my impression. But in the past, recently, because of the carbon neutral things, I tend to think that shale oil industry in US hasn't responded too quickly enough to offset that some oil price hike pressure. So that which is I think one of the important reasons why the oil prices went up so quickly last year. Now the oil price has been down a little bit, but so on and so forth. I think decarbonization or carbon neutral initiatives actually could have some inflationary impact on the economy. So what is your take on that structural impact on the of the carbon neutral initiatives?
I agree with you that in the short term, it could have the push to renewables and trying to become carbon neutral constrains the supply response when you have increase in fossil fuel prices, oil prices. So in the short run, that could be inflationary. But in the longer term, I think as the price of renewables go down, it gives you many more options to respond to increase in oil prices. And it's really the foundation of President Biden's green economy. He sees this as an engine of growth, a lot of new jobs, a lot of new industry, a lot of new investment, which could drive growth in the U.S. economy. So you've got the long-term growth impact and the long-term substitution effects, which would be very positive. But the transition in the short run, I agree with you, if you can't respond as quickly to increase supply of alternatives to oil, it could be inflationary. Again, another major driver of the increase in oil prices is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impact of Russian supply of oil globally. It's quite a tight market, and there's not a lot of flexibility. So it is complicated. I agree with it's a global market, but I think the key is to looking at the short term, I think, relatively transitory increase of inflation perhaps versus the long-term economic opportunity and perhaps as the price of renewables come down, viable, feasible competition to fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you very much. So last but not least, I think talking about inflation in US, we cannot ignore the excess demand factors. So, and we witnessed some extravagant spending, government spending in the second 2 years of the Biden administration, including CARES Act or other fiscal spending. So this, as Larry Summers insists, this should be this is definitely one of the important reasons why the inflationary pressure became so serious. So but now after the midterm election, now the House is now not controlled by the Democrats and instead by the Republicans by the narrow margin. But narrow margin that could mean that Biden administration cannot easily pass some new fiscal spending bill too easily. So it seems to me it is good for the U.S. economy. If the Biden administration had continued to spend a big size government spending, so the inflationary pressure will be much more fierce. But now the current situation is politically difficult, but it seems to me a better situation. Of course, we have to avoid fiscal cliff. This is definitely true. But is there any consensus among the Congress in the Congress that too much spending, government spending, is harmful to inflation? So we can be assured that the government will avoid too much fiscal spending.
Yeah, one advantage of divided government is you have checks and balances. And the Democrats, like the Republicans, have different factions, different wings. Some consider spending insufficient, especially for social protection, social insurance, and to improve equity. Others think that the government has to be fiscally responsible and cut back spending. And if you look at the amount of spending during the pandemic, all the packages together, including the final one under Biden, it's about 25% of GDP. And that's clearly not sustainable. And that has to have an impact on excess demand. And a very simple example, you can see if you try to travel now domestically in the United States, air travel, all the flights are fully booked. They're overbooked, even though the tickets are very, very expensive. People want to go places. They want to do things. And they have savings from the stimulus checks and so on. And some people also took early retirement during COVID, and they're just saving. So I do think that the pandemic spending, I think perhaps with the exception of the last package, was absolutely necessary and helped to prevent the worst impacts of the pandemic on the economy. But, you do have to get to something that's sustainable, and the deficit has been coming down steadily. And this, of course, affects the prudential soundness of fiscal policy. So it's not all bad to have some constraints on spending, and then it becomes a matter of priorities. So we do have a budget till the end of the fiscal year, which is September this year, September 30th. The question is what happens after that. And one of the advantages of having a split Congress is that the Republicans cannot undo some of the essential spending that's already been passed to basically upgrade our infrastructure, to fund the IRS so that they could actually increase revenue and increase the equity of tax collection and enforcement. So certain things that I think are essential in the spending packages cannot be undone, although they've tried, but it will be very difficult to add substantially. And I think, as you point out, that's not all bad. So I think your summary of kind of the advantages of having some restraint on spending will also help on the excess demand side to help curb inflation, and perhaps makes interventions from the Fed less large and over a shorter term, because then you would have fiscal policy and monetary policy that are essentially in harmony and reinforcing each other.
Thank you very much. So I would like to ask you the last question, which would be the some financial stability side issues. I know that Jay, you're expert on the emerging economy, especially Southeast Asia's economies. So we all know that emerging economies are having suffered from the capital inflow, too much capital inflow and capital outflow to and from US. And so with response to the Fed monetary policy. So, and maybe last year, many emerging economies were concerned that too rapid rate hike could jeopardize the financial condition of their domestic financial market, stock market or bond market. They were concerned about massive exodus of capital, from their market. But and you said your verdict is option 2.5, so that maybe mild rate hike would be with a mild rate hike. They shouldn't be so concerned about some financial imbalances or capital outflow risk. Or domestically, now there are high yield bond credit spread isn't so wide. So people are not so concerned. And the third thing is the property market. Property market is in China is a very serious situation. But now also the property market in US is now in the downturn. So do you see any pitfalls or some risks, financial risks this year? Emerging markets or some high yield bond market or property market. So could you please talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's good to bring in the perspective of emerging economies, and they're very sensitive to monetary policy in the United States, especially interest rate policy. They experienced this after the Great Recession, and they called it the tapering tantrum, as the Fed started to reduce money supply and increase interest rates. And there was hot capital, portfolio capital flowing out of these countries. And that created both a monetary and a fiscal crisis for them. They were forced to raise interest rates to keep capital in. But that also makes prices increase and makes them less competitive in many ways. So it affects the real sector as well as the financial sector. And a colleague of mine, the former Minister of Finance for Indonesia, who was Minister of Finance during the tapering tantrum, did a very good research paper when he was a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School on exactly this. What was the impact in Indonesia? How did they respond? And it's actually very popular right now because it's the same issues. And the advantage, so they're already raising interest rates. They're compelled to keep capital in and to remain competitive at a price. But if the Fed does 2.5 rather than 3, it means that the impact will be less dramatic and less long-lasting than it might be if the Fed has more dramatic increases over a longer period of time. But they're already feeling it, and it's driving both monetary and fiscal policy, at least throughout Southeast Asia. If you look at Thailand or Indonesia, for example, these are economies with open capital accounts and convertible currencies, which would be a little bit different from something like Vietnam. But if you're looking at these open capital accounts and convertible currencies, they have no choice but to react at great potential risk to domestic growth and as you said, financial stability. So my hope is that this will be less dramatic, less harmful than it was after the Great Recession. Then the last point on the real estate, well, clearly China, it's a bubble and it's a mess. You're the China expert. You know it better than I do. And by the way, congratulations on your recent book on China. I understand it's wonderful, but it's in Japanese. And in China, everything is interrelated. So it poses all sorts of financial risk. And then you have bank loans that are over-collateralized with property that's declining in value. You have empty cities and empty building blocks and all sorts of problems. But China is special, and it's big enough, I think, to figure out how to try to cushion the impact. It is a bubble. In the U.S., unlike the problems caused in the Great Recession that started with subprime mortgages and so on, and the entire real estate industry was hit everywhere in the United States, it's region dependent. Location matters, and it's a big, diverse economy. The problem with the real estate market in the U.S. isn't so much a bubble. The fact is that there's excess demand. A lot of people during COVID decided to work at home. And so you have a lot of and they wanted more space. and they could live outside the city because they didn't have to commute. So you have this great pressure on increased demand for housing, and it's very hard in the short term to increase supply of housing. So it's not really speculation in the U.S. as I think excess demand for limited supply. In China, it's clearly speculation. People were buying real estate to flip. And when you can't flip, you got a problem. And they were buying real estate before it was built. And then the developers go bankrupt and they can't deliver, and people are really upset because they want their money back. So I think the real estate situation in China is critical, but quite different from the rising real estate prices in the U.S. We could probably talk for hours about it. I'd love to hear your comments, perhaps offline, about this. But again, thank you for your wonderful questions. I remember at Harvard Kennedy School, I had a very, very upset student. And he said, I came to Harvard for answers, and all you give me is questions. Well, that's kind of what today's discussion was like. But as you know, former Bank of Japan and now as a professor, it's really important to ask the right questions. So in that way, I hope that our viewers...
I asked the right questions to you.
Yeah, well, hopefully this will benefit our viewers. So thank you very much for the very challenging questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I enjoyed very much our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Tomo and Jay. It was a very wonderful time to listen to questions and answers for me. And prior to concluding this session, I would like to ask one question. Actually, you have been talked about the so-called the interesting contrast emerging in judgment regarding the Japanese, Chinese, U.S. economies. But actually, I would like to invite your views about the so-called the Congress responses against vis-a-vis China's rights. Because right now, the setting aside the so-called contentious disagreement between Democrats and the Republicans, when it comes to China issue, especially Taiwan or Southeast Asia or South China Seas, actually, it seems to me, actually, I've never been to the United States for a long time, but so that both Democrats and Republicans are unanimously anti-China. And especially China is expanding its sphere of influence, not only in Asia, but also Africa and US's backyard, Latin America. Establishing PLA, taking full advantage of the usage of Argentine ports or something like that. So that actually setting, in addition to the uncertainty and developing in the U.S. economy, how congressional response have an effect on the fiscal responses. I'm very curious to know your opinion. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is a strong anti-China sentiment across the political spectrum in the United States, which is very unhelpful. Again, it would seem obvious that the tariffs should be reduced that President Trump introduced because, of course, China doesn't pay them, American consumers pay them. And it contributes to supply shortages. So they have to work together on the environment, on global public goods. And I think it was very significant during the last G20 summit in Bali when President Biden met with President of China. Even if it was pleasantries, it was several hours, they were seen together with their senior teams just to keep talking. It's important to talk to your friends, but it's more important to talk to rivals. And that was an indication of how concerned the rest of the world was that they weren't even talking with each other. And the real fear is due to lack of communication, somebody makes a mistake, especially with Taiwan. You've seen very close encounters between aircraft, U.S. and Chinese, and you don't want, somebody being over exuberant and making a mistake, causing a downward spiral. And ASEAN, Southeast Asia, does not want to have to choose between China and the United States, which is another challenge for the U.S. China is a really important trade partner and investor, and it's in the region. U.S. is also very important. So again, you see a recalibration of U.S. policy towards ASEAN to try not to force choices. It's complicated. It's a lot of it's counterproductive and dangerous. And you can't decouple the economies. You can't decouple the countries. So my hope is that they'll find areas where they can work together, especially in these global public goods, and agree to disagree in many other areas as legitimate competitors. But it's an important challenge for both sides to manage, and it's concerning, but at least, as I said, there have been a few positive signs, and the meeting in Bali has been followed up by other senior level meetings of cabinet members. So at least if there's a dialogue and they're talking, it's the first step to try to figure out where they can have mutually beneficial cooperation. But it's clearly a global risk, as you point out.
Thank you very much indeed. Actually, having read the recent book written by Henry Kissinger, he worried about the so-called leadership vacuum. So that we have to be very vigilant against the so-called collapse of leadership vacuum. At the same time, the so-called economic collapse of the three major economies. So that I would like to continue to discuss among ourselves, Jay, Tomo, and our institute. Thank you very much indeed. So I would like to conclude this seminar.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.